Hi again, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at Sonata Form. This is going to be the largest of the forms that we're going to discuss in this course. Then we're going to, we're going to see how this sort of is an outbreak of rounded binary form. Make sure you have some Spotify or YouTube nearby to listen to the recording of the piece here. Make sure you have your printout. All right, so Sonata Form, I'm sure many of you are at least somewhat familiar with this form. It's going to be a large form frequently found in the opening allegro movements of works. So that would be like your symphonies, your sonatas, your string quartets. They tend to be in sonata form. Also, some of the other movements will sometimes be in sonata form as well. Now, as I just mentioned, it's actually kind of based on the idea of rounded binary form. You'll recall in the first section of rounded binary, you had the establishment of the main key, oftentimes a modulation to a new key. Then after the double bar, this is stage 3, you would get an area of harmonic and thematic instability. And then you would get, if it was a rounded binary form, you would get a recapitulation of the materials from the first part in the tonic key. Well, sonata form is going to retain these 4 stages, but we're going to create some thematic stations along the way. So the music before the double bar is what's going to be known as the exposition. And that's going to have several different themes along the way. Then after the double bar, you're going to get the development that corresponds to the digression from rounded binary, and the recapitulation, which corresponds to, yes, the recap music from the rounded binary. So that will be the last 2 stages would be the music after the double bar. Again, I assume most of you know a little bit about this already. All right, let's go ahead and get into some of the details. You might also want to have your next page available that has the diagram. I'll show that in a second though. So let's go ahead and start with the exposition. All right, so the exposition will contain 4 thematic zones. Each will correspond to a particular key. And oftentimes there's a particular cadence that ends these different thematic areas. So the 4 areas are P, transition, S, and C. If we flip ahead real quick to the back page, I'll keep showing you this diagram. Exposition, P, transition, S, and C. Then we're going to get into what happens below here. This is sort of what my diagrams are going to look like. I'm going to put the key areas underneath it. I'm also going to put some of the important cadences right below the thematic labels. So, primary theme, as you can imagine, is going to occur in the tonic key. It's going to give you your basic important theme for the movement. You can expect any thematic structure. I'd say from experience that sentence structure is the most common, or maybe some sort of hybrid between the period and the sentence. We talked about that during the thematic structure lecture. Now, the primary theme, this is going to be true for, there always needs to be some sort of cadence that ends each thematic area. The primary theme is unique in that we don't know what type of cadence it's going to be. It could be a PAC, that would be a tonally closed primary theme, or it could be a half cadence. The important thing is that some sort of cadence has to happen before you ever move on to another section. All right, so as you can see in the diagram, the end of P could be a PAC or a half cadence, or even an IAC, I assume could happen as well. Now, the type of cadence is going to have a lot of repercussions, though, for the transition. I mean, if it's a half cadence, there's often something interesting about the transition and how it relates to P. If it's a PAC, then it's more likely that you're going to get a very kind of what we call an independent transition. I'll mention what that is in a second. Anyhow, don't ever move into the transition zone without a cadence of some sort for P. We're always going to kind of label things according to where the cadences occur. All right, now what's going to be true of the transition? There's several things that will happen here that will be big giveaways for a transition zone. One is the building of energy. So it's going to kind of gradually build energy to a kind of climactic arrival on the dominant chord. There's often also a long dominant prolongation. That doesn't always happen, but still this kind of energy building, arrival on the dominant chord. Usually, a transition section will modulate to the secondary key. So modulation is another association with transition sections. It's important to note that some transitions, however, do not modulate. If you look at a lot of Mozart piano sonatas, you'll see there's a huge number of them actually that don't modulate during their transition zones. They still do these other things. They still build energy, they still arrive on a dominant chord, and so on. So you can still know that they're transition sections. It tends to, the non-modulating option tends to happen more often in a short sonata form movement. The longer ones, they tend to modulate. Now, another big giveaway for the transition is the ending of it. I mentioned the arrival on the 5 chord. So that kind of gives you an idea that usually a transition will culminate with an emphatic half cadence, often followed by a gap or a rest. So dun, 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 and some sort of rest. This gap between the end of the transition and the beginning of the S theme is called the medial caesura. We abbreviate that MC. So medial happening halfway through the exposition, and caesura means basically a gap or rest. That's a term from the sonata theory of Hepakoski and Darcy, but it's kind of a well-known term by now. Actually, let me, before I go into the next point. So notice in the diagram of the transition, we're going to build energy, we're going to arrive on an emphatic half cadence, and there's going to be the medial caesura, and then S will pick up. Now, some other terminology for transitions. This is C. They may be independent or dependent. Independent transitions contain their own unique thematic material, whereas dependent transitions use the thematic idea of P, or perhaps they dissolve out of the P theme. Now, the cadence that ends the P theme is often important here. If the P theme ends with a nice PAC and is really closed off, that means that you're more likely to get a transition that's independent. It'll have its own theme. Whereas if let's say that P actually ended with a half cadence, sometimes what will happen then is you'll get P back, you'll get the P theme again, but it will dissolve out of P and become the transition. That's known as a dissolving P theme, and it's a type of dependent transition. So independent or dependent. We'll see an example of this later. The one for the homework's a little more complex, but so you'll have some options for ways of looking at that. All right, so now that we've had the medial caesura, we can move on to the secondary theme. Now, of course, very important, the secondary theme occurs in the secondary key. If you're in a major mode piece, it's the same key relationships from rounded binary. If it's a major mode piece, the key is usually 5, but if it's a minor mode piece, the key of the secondary theme will be 3, relative major, or sometimes the minor 5. So B, the role, so you're gonna get another theme. It's could be a period, could be a sentence, something, but the main thing you're listening for in the secondary theme is what happens next, because the main role of the secondary theme is to confirm this secondary key. Therefore, S will end once you arrive at the first PAC in the secondary key, assuming that there's a new theme after this PAC. So if you got a PAC and then you return to the S theme, that wouldn't be it. But you're kind of thinking, where does S end? You're listening for a PAC. You're listening for this confirmation. And then if there's a new theme after it, you know that S has ended. So PAC, transition, ends with a half cadence. But the S theme will be in the key of the dominant, or 3 if it's a minor key, and it's going to end with a PAC. After that, you enter the closing zone. All right, so what happens in the closing zone? This is the material that occurs after the PAC that ends S. In this section, you're only allowed to have further PACs, all right? If you ever encountered a half cadence, probably something complex is going on there that we won't get into. Now, some closing zones are short, whereas others are longer and contain multiple C themes. You could have a C1, a C2, and so on. Now, it kind of depends actually in many ways on S, which one you get. If you get a longer S theme that really holds off the PAC for a long time, like if you're really just waiting and anticipating the PAC, then you're more likely to get a short closing zone. If, however, you get a shorter shorter S theme and get the PAC relatively early, then you might get this multiple thematic C zone. You might get a C1, a C2, and so on. If you're going to use this option, though, if you're going to have a C2 theme, there must be another PAC during C that leads to the new themes. In other words, PACs are what allow you to move on to the next number if you're going to have multiple C themes. Okay, let's take a look now at this diagram one more time just to review what we just learned. So P in the tonic key ends with some sort of cadence, but we're not sure. Transition builds energy, usually modulates, but not always, ends with an emphatic half cadence, and then the medial caesura, that gap. Then S will be in the secondary key, either 5 if it's a major mode piece, or 3 or minor 5 in a minor mode piece. And S will end with the PAC, that gives you your harmonic conformation, and then you have a tonally stable closing zone, which can be short or it can be very long in some cases. But closing zone is basically just sort of celebrating the conformation of the secondary key. All right, now let's go on and do a little practice. On the next 2 pages, I've given you the exposition of this piece by Mozart. What I want you to do here is to answer these questions and also do a little labeling. Just use this up here to do your labeling. I want you to label, and for example, if you're not sure what the cadence is, you can put in this now for this particular piece. Label the beginning measures of each of the thematic areas. Answer whether it's an independent or dependent transition. That will give us a chance to review what that means. And then, is this C zone a short one or a longer one? Of course, that all depends on what happens in S. Is that cadence held off for a while or not? Now, so what I recommend you all do is find a recording of this online, or maybe you already have it in your collection, and listen to the exposition twice. In other words, listen to the repeat so you can hear it twice. Then we'll come back and we'll take a look at my answers for this. So go ahead and pause this video and go listen to this music. Okay, all right, here are my answers for the beginning of P, obviously measure 1, that's pretty much a given. This is a major mode piece, so we're looking at the major mode Roman numerals. Transition was at measure 21. The ending of P was a PAC. Now I hope some of you might have been inclined to put the transition earlier, like maybe around here. But remember, we haven't had any cadence. We can't put the transition until at least there's some sort of cadence. Could have been a half cadence or a PAC, but there's clearly no cadence. This music right here is still part of the P theme. That's trying to end the P theme. So we actually get the PAC right here at 21, and then we have the transition. Now this was an independent transition. It has its own theme. And again, that kind of relates to the fact that we did have a PAC that ended P. So that gives us the opportunity to launch a new theme for the transition. Then the transition did all that we would expect. It gains energy. It modulates somewhere around, let me see, where was it? Right here. Here's where we get the F sharp to our modulation to the key of G major, which would be 5. Gaining energy. Then arriving on the medial, the half cadence right here in the key of 5, and we have this gap. That's the medial caesura. Sometimes the gap is filled in, and we do get a couple measures of kind of filling in the gap right here before S begins. So then S started right here, measure 35 in the key of G major, And this was a relatively long S. I mean, not extremely long, but it did hold off the cadence for a little bit. So we had like right around here, we had a moment where we kind of got a little bit of a digression to avoid the cadence and really gain some momentum. Then we get a big PAC right here. Remember, S has to end with a PAC, which then allows the closing zone to happen right here. And this was a short closing zone, as you can see here on just a few measures. So again, here's what the answers look like for this one. This was very textbook for an exposition. Nothing really surprising happened per se. But again, note we definitely did get the half cadence here in the PAC. This one is one that I threw in there because it could be a half cadence or a PAC. This was a half cadence, independent transition, and so on and so forth. So this was a short closing zone too. All right, let's go ahead and pick up now and talk about what happens next. All right, now let's talk about the music after the double bar. If you look at the bottom of this page, I have the diagram of the rest of the sonata form. This is after the double bar. This is where we get both development and recapitulation. But let's talk about each of these sections on their own, as opposed to all together. So we'll talk about the development, do a little analysis, then we'll talk about the recap and do a little analysis. As mentioned before, the development corresponds to the digression phrase of a rounded binary form. So you'll remember that was a section that was tonally and thematically unstable. It was a section that ended with the 5 chord, like a half cadence in the main key. These same things are going to happen here. We're just going to blow this up with some interesting stuff. So the same way that the exposition embellishes what happens in a rounded binary with some themes, same thing will happen in the development. The development, however, is definitely the most unpredictable section. So an abstract diagram can't predict what's going to happen in an actual piece. As you probably know, development means to take music from the exposition and to use what we call developmental techniques. And they tend to be things like modulation. You're going to move through various keys. Thematic fragmentation. So instead of getting the full themes back, you get them used in fragments. And lots of sequences. So this is where your knowledge of sequences is going to come into play. Lots of sequences tend to happen, particularly the descending fifth sequence is a real favorite for classical era composers. Now, one thing you can do with this is kind of interesting, and it's difficult to know when these different sections, stages begin and end, but many developments have the structure of a pre-core retransitions. These are terms from William Kaplan's classical form book. So pre-core retransition. What's that going to be? Pre-core is what usually happens at the very beginning of the development. A lot of times where we return to P in some non-tonic key, and it's usually stated at a low dynamic level. So pre-core, we usually get P at the very beginning, and it's usually at a low dynamic and in some non-tonic key. So this is somewhat predictable. I mean, there are some developments that don't start off this way, but we might get P. I put X because we don't know what the key is going to be. It's sort of like just kind of warming you up a little bit for the development before we really kind of take off. Then there's the core. The core is the central section of the development. It can be hard to know exactly where this starts, but this is where you're going to get all of the characteristic stereotypical features, like what I mentioned above, lots of modulations, thematic sequences, stuff like that. A lot of times this is where you go into minor keys and you have the Sturm und Drang style. So that will be the core. Again, difficult to know exactly where this begins and ends in certain pieces because development sections are very fluid. Then finally, we're going to get the music that kind of corresponds to that arrival on the 5 in the rounded binary form, what we call the retransition. This would be the phrase or the kind of moment roughly corresponding to the arrival of the dominant prolongation in the main key. And this will set up the expectation for a subsequent recapitulation. So core, all these sequences, I'm not sure what keys they're going to be, and we're going to get a little thematic fragmentation. And then retransition is the music around the arrival of the 5 chord. It can be difficult to know where to place this. I would just say no later than the arrival of the 5 chord. Sometimes if you want to go a little bit earlier to the music that's the beginning of the phrase to that, that's fine. Each one's different though. But at the very latest, definitely don't put the beginning of the retransition at some point after we've already arrived on the 5 chord. There's usually a long dominant prolongation, really setting up our expectation for a recap section. All right, now let's go ahead, and I hope you all paused your recordings where you stopped there. And I want you to listen to the development section of the piece, which is on the next couple pages. I think it goes to around measure 94. So start right here at measure 59. And I want you to use this, I know there's not too much room, and try to fill in some of the information. Down here, fill in what keys happen. Fill in the beginning measures of the pre-core, core, and retransition. Also, try to note around here what themes are being developed. Really take a lot of care to look at what keys are visited. You might want to put the Roman numeral of the key plus the key name itself and see if you can determine any pattern. Is there a pattern to the keys? I think you'll find something interesting here. All right, so go ahead and pause the video and find your recording and listen to the development. Then we'll come back and see what we have. Okay, just take a look at my development diagram here. I'll show this again in a second. Let me actually just take a look at the score, and I'll walk you through what happens, and I'll show you how I analyzed it in my diagram. So if I'm going to walk you through this development, we start with the P theme, and it's in the key of G minor. So we had modulated to G major at the end of the exposition. Now we just changed the mode to G minor. So this is the pre-core, right? Notice the low dynamic level and so on. So we get P here, G minor, then we get P again here in D minor. This is basically the identical music to this, but just in the key of D minor. Then right here, we get the development of P. Notice that da, 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 da. Here we're fragmenting it. We're in the key of A minor. Now, as you probably guessed, this is the beginning of the core, or at least that's where I would put it. It's always difficult to know exactly, but I would put the beginning of the core right here. We have now the very unstable section. We're really moving through keys fast. We're doing sequences, right? Da, 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 da. So a little sequencing going on here. It's in the key of A minor. That's developing P. Then we actually get a surprise PAC right here, still in the key of A minor. And if you notice right here, we get the C theme in A minor. So we went from P being developed to C being developed in the key of A minor. Seems like we're staying in the key of A minor for a little while. That's a little bit unpredictable though, really. It's not that common to get the C theme back. Now this might have surprised you a little bit. P, da, 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 same motive again, in A minor again. So back to P. This might be a little bit of what we sometimes call a false recapitulation. Maybe the listener is a little bit confused. Of course, we knew that the exposition's in a major mode, so not too much of a trick. All right, P in A minor. Then I get P again, but this one's interesting. It's actually the 5/7 chord. Okay. So I guess the question is, we were in the core, where do I put the retransition? I'd say there are two options. One would be right here, because if right here is where the exposition or the recap's going to happen. I'd say right here would be the latest you could put the retransition symbol, because that's the 5 chord in the main key, right? That's the main goal of the development. You could also put it right here, because it just seems like this is the beginning of the whole retransition stuff. So if you want to put it all the way back in 86, that's also fine. Now let's take a look at my diagram. Again, you have some different options for some of these spots, and see if we notice anything interesting here. So notice I had P being developed. I have the pre-core, core retransition. I put it late at the not measure 90, but you could have put it earlier at 86. And look at the pattern of keys: G minor, D minor, A minor. And then that goes to the 5 chord. So what's the pattern? Ascending fifths, right? Minor keys ascending by fifths. So there is a real logic to the key areas being visited here. So I really enjoy this development. I think this is really the best part of this piece, the development section. Very, very cleverly put together, and really working through the best thematic material of the exposition, which was that little P motive that's very distinctive. All right, so now that we talked about the development, let's go on finally to the recapitulation. Now, this should be the simplest to discuss because this is so predictable in many ways. We're going to get all 4 themes back: P, transition, S, and C. I will mention that sometimes there's an entirely new transition, but still, we're going to get those zones. And it's all going to be in the tonic key. If you have a minor mode work, when you get to S, you could also have it in the parallel major. So either goes to the parallel major one or to the minor one. If it's the minor one, you'll notice that actually that involves recomposing the music from the exposition, because that music's usually in a major mode, so it's kind of like a tragic option. All right, where was I? Now, as far as, so this is all very predictable. We're gonna get the same half cadence before S, the same PAC before C. Anything else to listen for in the recapitulation? Well, I think one thing you're looking for is, how much work did the composer do? Did they do the minimal amount of work possible here, or did they do some extra interesting things? We know that somewhere within the P, or the transition, the music has to be altered from the exposition because we don't want to modulate, right? So what happens is that there's going to be some moment around P, or usually more commonly around the transition, where there's going to be some alterations happening. All right, the music's going to get off track from what happened in the exposition to avoid the modulation. Then, usually somewhere a little bit before S happens, it's going to lock back on to the same music from before. But now it will be transposed to avoid this modulation. This moment, the moment where we lock back onto the materials from the exposition, is known as the crux. All right, I'll mention more about that. The piece we have here for this lecture is not the clearest example of this, but your homework's kind of a real clear example of this sense of we slide off somewhere around here, then we get back on, but transpose. So somewhere, so oftentimes around here, there's going to be this moment of a crux. The very latest it could be would be right here. Once the composer has arrived at the crux, they're allowed to just transpose the rest of it. Okay, sometimes they make some changes, but just to make it interesting, but they really could just transpose the rest of this and be done with the composition of the piece. All right, now that we've talked about that, whoops, sorry, I already had my answers there, didn't I? Whoops. So now that we've talked about that, go ahead and listen to the recap and answer the questions that I have. So just mark the beginning measures. I hope you didn't write down what I just showed you. So then listen for that thing. Where does it depart from the exposition, and where is the crux? Now be careful. Sometimes there's small departures. And then ask yourself, is there any additional unnecessary alterations made to the music? These usually happen during S or C, but here it's actually going to be within P or transition. There's going to be some unnecessary alterations. All right, so go ahead and give it a listen, and then come back and we'll talk about the answers. Okay, so this is the beginning of the recap right here. P, we're in the key of C major. as we expect. Now, this is a little bit of a tricky thing here. I'd ask you to look for where the music first departs, and you might have thought right here, where you go to C minor when you have this extra music. This is a little bit different though, because we do depart, but then we're already back on right here for the end of P. Where's that page? Sorry. This is sort of the continuation section of the theme. That's still P, so we actually haven't had any substantial alterations there. There was a kind of surprise move to C minor for a moment, but that's not really what I'm talking about. The question is then, where does the music, so we have P right here, then we have the transition right here, same music from before. But again, we can't modulate here, so what happens? Where does Mozart get off? This is all exactly the same. Yeah, this is all the same. It's right around here. Actually, what Mozart does is he deletes a couple measures. This is where we move off the exposition pattern. Where do we get back on, though? It's actually very late. It's right here at the medial caesura. This is the crux right here, the moment of the half cadence. That's where we're back to where we were before, just transposed. After that, the rest of this can proceed as a transposition of the exposition. So we have the S right here. Now, some of you may have been thinking that was an alteration, but this is sort of just a textural thing. This is essentially the S theme from before. We just sort of switched hands. So S in the key of C major, we avoided the modulation by doing those alterations. And then I believe there are no other substantial alterations. We have the PAC right here. Therefore, this is the closing theme. And that's it. So actually, if you look at what Mozart did in the recap, he hardly did any changes whatsoever. He did the very minimal. There's something that happened during P that was completely unnecessary just to keep you kind of on your toes. But after that moment, the whole issue with the crux, he just deleted a couple measures basically to avoid the modulation. All right, let me show you my answers for the recap again. So P 94, transition 116, S 129, C 148, and again we got the half cadence PAC, and again this only refers to the major mode one. So really recaps are usually pretty straightforward. It's just the issue of what alterations are made. Okay.